Now, basically, there are two kinds of fear. There's physical fear and mental, psychological fear. Now, physical fear is something that is more easy to understand, because it's a part of our instinctive animal behavior. And when we're young, our parents, our elders, have to teach us the dangers of the physical dangers that we can experience. Just like young animals have to be taught the physical dangers of the environment. But once we learn physical dangers and we become more aware, then our natural instinct takes over. And of course, when we're faced with any type of physical danger, we experience this fear. So it's something quite natural in our human nature. But mental psychological fear is more complex. Because as human beings, we're thinking primates. And as you know, we tend to think too much. Although we need to think in daily life, we have to use our memory, our knowledge, our expertise. But you find that even when we don't need to think, the mind keeps thinking unnecessarily. So, because thinking becomes very compulsive. It's a very compulsive habit in human consciousness. And because we're not taught to understand the nature of thinking, when we're in school and we're not taught about the benefits of mindfulness and mindfulness practice, we think that we think and believe that we have to be thinking all the time. And so we identify very strongly with our thinking process, our mental formations. And that includes, our ideas, views, and opinions. And we tend to worship knowledge, book knowledge, academic knowledge. And that's why, in the end, most of us suffer from neurosis to varying degrees. Neurosis is when we identify totally with thinking, and every time we use the word I, which is a social label, we think this I is who we are. And we become very attached to this I. And of course, we experience a lot of fear, a lot of desires, frustrations, and insecurity, because we try to protect this I. Now, the model I like to use when I'm describing this mental, psychological fear, is that of tree. You have the different branches of the tree, which are the different types of mental, psychological fears that we have. And we have the connecting trunk of the tree, the connecting factors of fear. And there are three factors that connect all our mental, psychological fears. And then there is the root of the tree of fear. So we can explore the different types of mental, psychological fears that we have. There's the fear of not being successful, fear of not achieving your goals, the fear of not getting what you want, fear of being a failure. And in some ways, these fears are connected to the fear of not pleasing your parents and close relatives, family expectations. And there's also the fear of not getting married and having children. The fear of not being loved and accepted. There's the fear of being judged and criticized. The praise and blame. There's also the fear of loss. And the fear of change. There's also the fear of sickness, aging, and death. And death is a great unknown, the mystery of death. So the fear of the unknown. And there's also the fear of uncertainty and the future, because the future is always uncertain. And this is why mindfulness meditation practice helps us to deal with this uncertainty of life, because it makes our mind more stable, more focused, so we can deal more effectively with uncertainty. There's also the fear of loneliness and isolation. The fear of pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain. There's also the fear of public opinion, fear of what people are saying, even thinking about us. There's a fear of authority, and the fear of ghosts and spirits. Interestingly, the fear of authority and the fear of ghosts and spirits have something in common. Just like a few of our other fears. And there's a fear that is associated with guilt, because guilt is an aspect of fear. So we'll discuss this. And for some people, including monastics, there's a fear of not achieving enlightenment, the fear of not becoming an arahant or a bodhisattva. So that, I think, are the main fears we have. And you also have those fears that are not so common, like claustrophobia, you know, the fear of enclosed space. And the opposite of that is the fear of open space. It's a very rare fear, but there are some people in the West, in Western countries, that have this fear. The word for it is called agoraphobia. Agoraphobia. You might have heard of it, where people are afraid of open space. They're afraid of going outside, so they remain trapped inside their homes. And you also have those childhood fears, you know, the fear of insects and mice and rats, fear of lizards, fear of snakes. A few people are afraid of animal fur. And some people are afraid of feathers, you know, bird feathers. All types of these fears. But most of these fears begin in childhood. They begin in childhood. A lot of their fears actually start in childhood. Including the fear of ghosts and spirits, right? Because you're told when you're young, you know, don't go outside at night, because the spirits are outside. So you imagine these spirits. Because where I grew up, we had a lot of African influence. So I was told about African ghosts and spirits. And I really believe them. And I used to imagine them also. Because, you know, when you're young, you have a very vivid imagination. And you think it's real. But only later I began to realize it's just the power of the imagination. But with mindfulness, you're able to overcome it. Now, the fear of not being successful, of not achieving your goals, basically the fear of not getting what you want, I think it's related to two things. One is family pressure, you know, especially if your parents have a high expectation of you. And the other cause for this, I believe, is our conditioned habit of comparing ourselves to others. Because when we compare ourselves to others, most of the time we feel inferior. We're not as good as other people. I'm not as successful. I'm not as wealthy. I'm not as popular. So naturally that causes the craving. The craving to become. You want to be as successful as other people. And it can be family members, like say siblings. It can be friends. It can be relatives. It can be co-workers, you know, and so on. And with that, of course, is the fear of not pleasing your parents and your close relatives, especially if they have high expectations of you. So naturally, it creates more anxiety in the mind. I'd like to tell the story of a student I once met at a Dhamma camp many years ago in Malaysia. And he was a very bright student, not only academically, but he was very intelligent. And he was telling me that every time he had to study for a test or an exam, he was very nervous. So I said, why? You know, you're a very good student. He said, the problem is not me, it's my parents. They're both school teachers, and he was always top of his class from elementary school days. So you can imagine his parents were very proud of him, and they liked to boast. You know, my son is always number one. And it just so happened that the last 2 years, he happened for the first time to come second, and 1 year he came third. And his parents were very displeased, even though he still had, you know, A plus grades. But the parents never saw the grades. My son has to be number one. And these were teachers, so you think they would know better, but they didn't. Very ignorant and immature behavior, because it was all ego, you know, always their ego involved. So I said to him, I would really like to meet your parents, and I want to give them a very good scolding, because I can be very direct. He was a little nervous, and he said, it's okay, Bhante, thank you, but I'll speak to them myself. I said, don't worry, I don't live in Malaysia. I can scold them and then leave the country. But it shows you that, you know, even school teachers can be very ignorant and very immature. Because maturity, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily come with age, right? You can still be in your 50s, 60s, 70s, and still be immature. Meaning you still have a strong attachment to ego, you know, to self. And you still think that you're the center of the world and the universe. So as I said, this fear has a lot to do with family expectations and the habit of comparing yourself to others. Interestingly, occasionally someone will feel superior to others when they compare themselves. Most people will feel inferior. But occasionally somebody will feel superior. And they're very proud. And what is interesting, that the person who feels superior, behind that superiority complex is fear. It's insecurity. Just like people who have a aggressive type of behavior, behind that aggression is always fear. Because if you don't have fear, there is no need to be aggressive. There's no need to be competitive. So people who are very competitive, they're very anxious people. And sometimes externally they might not seem that anxious, but behind it there is anxiety, there's insecurity there. Very interesting. And again, the fear of getting married, of not getting married and having children, that comes usually from family expectations. And sometimes you get it from peer pressure, from your friends, maybe your other siblings. You know, if they are married and you're not married. It's always interesting, you know, when I used to go to weddings. This was before I became a monk. And of course, when you're single, you know, and you pass a certain age, everybody at the wedding is wondering, when are you going to get married? You know the saying, monkey see, monkey do. That's right. So one of the lines I used to give people is, I don't want to make anyone unhappy, miserable. So I'd rather be single, out of compassion. Because the truth is, marriage is not for everyone, right? And when you look at the high divorce rate, that is obvious. Marriage is just not for everyone. And part of it too is the fear of loneliness, fear of isolation. And sometimes people will tell you that you might be happy being single, but what happens to you in old age? Who's going to take care of you? Of course, the future is uncertain. You know, you might not live to old age, right? But you see, the mind likes to project, right? Likes to project in the future. Because that's the nature of thinking. Thinking is always moving in time from past to future, past to future. And thinking is related to memory, to past experience and to knowledge, information. You can observe that in your mind. Knowledge, past experience, information, memory. And as you know, when we have unpleasant memories, those unpleasant memories can seem very, very solid, very permanent, especially when there are emotions involved. Because as you know, you can remember something that happened a few years previously, and you can still get upset, right? Or you still have regret, you can still feel guilty about something you did. And the reason why guilt is an aspect of fear is because we tend to create a negative image of ourselves. When we've made a mistake and we start feeling guilty, we tend to create a negative image of ourselves. You know, I'm so terrible, I'm stupid, I'm bad, I'm awful. Why did I do that? Why did I make that mistake? Or why did I say certain things? So having that negative image creates conflict and fear in the mind, plus the other judgmental thoughts. Now, it is natural to have regrets. We can all relate to that. But if we keep having regrets and feeling guilty, then we end up torturing ourselves. You create a lot of conflict in the mind. So this is why it's important when we make mistakes, we have to forgive ourselves for being human. Because as human beings, we are not perfect. And everyone makes mistakes. Everyone, monks included. Because monks are human beings too. Just like if you happen to have a conflict with somebody, we tend to create a negative image of that person, right? Whereas if you don't have a conflict with anyone, we tend to have a positive image of them. If you've always had pleasant experiences with them. But when we have a conflict with somebody, and it can be anyone, you know, it can be a family member, your partner, a close friend, a co-worker, your neighbor, and so on, then we tend to create this negative image of that person. It's just the way the mind works, because it's based on memory. So this is why the practice of loving kindness is very beneficial when we're suffering from guilt and we have this negative image of ourselves. Because when we do loving kindness meditation, we replace those negative, judgmental thoughts with kind, positive thoughts. May I be well, happy, and peaceful. May I be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. May all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. May all beings be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. And of course, we try to learn from our mistakes. Very important. So a good question to always ask ourselves is, what can I learn from this experience? Instead of blaming yourself or blaming others for the way you feel, a very wise attitude is to ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Now, the fear of loss has to do with dependency. And there are two types of dependency: physical dependency and emotional dependency. Now, as human beings, we have to depend on each other quite often. That's physical dependency. We can help each other. Just like we have to depend on people to do things. But when we become emotionally dependent, then it's something more complicated. Because from that emotional dependency comes a strong attachment, emotional attachment. And with emotional attachment comes the fear of loss. Whether it's regarding people or material things. So this is why we have to ask ourselves, why do we become emotionally dependent on others or on certain material things? And that is because we're looking outside of ourselves, which is a part of our conditioning. And so this is why Dhamma practice is so beneficial, because you're going within yourself and finding that understanding, that wisdom, and that peace, that sense of peace. Because part of our social conditioning is to look outside of ourselves and to react. That's the way we're educated, our social conditioning. Our minds, our brains have been educated to react. First we label things, because we need labels to communicate, and then we judge. We criticize, we compare, sometimes we condemn, and then we like or not like, want, not want, and then to have aversion and ill will, which includes, resentment, hatred, jealousy, envy, and so on. Now, from the Dhamma perspective, we're all deluded by our reactions. But initially, we don't see it as delusion. Why? Because we all do it. We think this is normal social behavior. And it seems that way. And this is why the Buddha, who was so radical and so rational, he said, stop reacting. When you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. It's a very radical advice. It sounds simple, but as you know, it's very difficult to practice. Because we're all conditioned, right, from childhood, to be always reacting. And as I said, we think this is normal behavior. But when we begin to practice, to bring more mindfulness in our daily life, we begin to see that our habitual reactions is what creates our mental, emotional reality. We are creating our own mental, emotional reality. And it's often being said that life is really 10% of things happening and 90% of us reacting to it. And we think our mental emotional reality is, we think it's real, and we think it's important, and we think it's permanent. But actually it's not. It's often a source of not only conflict, some form of suffering, but also delusion. We are deluded by our mental, emotional reactions. Again, the Buddha's advice was, when you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. Very radical teaching. And he also continued by saying, when you think, just think, and when you know, just know. What that means is that when we need to think, we think logically, rationally, and when we don't need to think, the mind can be quiet. We come back to present moment awareness. So we don't have to be thinking all the time. There's order in the mind. So with this, with mind training and understanding, we can go between thinking and awareness. We move between the conditioned mind and the unconditioned mind. That is order, that's wisdom, that is intelligence. Because as you know, thinking can become very irrational, all right? Very illogical and very negative. And it becomes very illogical, very irrational when it becomes obsessive, all right? Like worrying is a good example of it. And you're thinking, oh, you know, this might happen and that might happen and this might happen and that might happen, right? There's the fear, the anxiety that's created by worrying. And as you know, for some people, it's a habit. There's some people who have this habit of worrying. And if you tell that person that it's a waste of time and you don't have to be worrying, that person will give you many reasons why I must worry. Right? They will give you, 1,001 reasons why I must worry. Just like when you're anxious, you have that compulsion, I must check my messages, right, on my phone. And that's why the addiction is so strong to this smartphone technology. Because with that anxiety, you think that if I don't check my messages, somehow the world is going to come to an end. Of course, it never does, but you think that way because of the anxiety. I see this very clearly in Singapore. Because, they're already very anxious, very impatient, and the smartphone technology is making them even more anxious and more impatient. This is why if you ever go on a retreat, you have to hand in your phone, right? And part of the practice, especially the first 3 days, is to observe that strong craving to check your phone. Of course, if there's a family emergency, that's another matter, right? But as you know, most of our messages are not really that emergent, not that important. But we just believe it is because of the anxiety. Now, the fear of change, this has to do with not understanding that we exist, we're alive because of change. And one of the Dhamma practices is to see this clearly. Because when you're busy, you don't see this. For example, if I told you that you're a process of body and mind, physical and mental phenomena, it's just an idea. But if you apply mindfulness, present moment awareness, you begin to see this more clearly. For example, say if you're breathing mindfully, the physical sensation of the breath, just feel the body breathing. That's the physical process, the physical phenomena. And the awareness of the body breathing is mind, the mental process. Again, the physical sensation of breathing is the body, and the awareness of the body breathing is the mind. So you see that there is physical and mental process. Now, when you're doing mindful, say walking, or any mindful movement, you can see this more clearly initially. For example, say if you're walking mindfully, your feet moving and stepping is the body, the physical process. And the awareness of the body moving, of the legs moving and stepping, that is the mind. So you see that there is the physical and the mental process. So you can do this as a reflection. Every time you do mindful breathing or mindful walking, just reflect on the body and the mind, the physical and the mental, rupa and nama. And we're alive because we're this process. And it's a very complex process. And because we're a process, we have to keep recharging this process. In the same way that you recharge your cell phones. And I mentioned before that even the process of digestion is very, very complex. But most of the time, we don't have to worry about it, unless you're having digestion problem. But if you're fairly healthy, the body has this intelligence to take care of this complexity. So when we do this reflection, then the truth of process, this constant change, becomes clear. It becomes a reality. It's not just an idea. And of course, you're mindful, you see all our sense experiences, all our sense perceptions and memory, the ability to recognize things. You can see it's always changing. What we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we smell, what we feel by touch, and of course what we think. We can see the truth of change, of process. And because we're this constantly changing process of body and mind, this is why all our experiences are impermanent. Whether it's mental, emotional, or physical. So when we have a deeper understanding of process and constantly changing, then we have less fear of change. And now the fear of loneliness and isolation. This comes from not only thinking too much, but we're thinking too much about ourselves. When we're too self-centered, we tend to experience this fear of loneliness and isolation. Because when the mind is agitated, we tend to crave some form of outside stimulation, including company. You know, we crave company. And you begin to see that there's a difference between aloneness and loneliness. Because our basic nature is aloneness. As the saying goes, we're born alone and we die alone. And if you're hungry, no one can eat for you. Right? It's like if you're tired, no one can rest for you. If you have to go to the washroom, no one can go for you. Right? These are basic facts of life. And of course, when we're calm, we can appreciate being alone. We can accept aloneness. Of course, sometimes it's good to have company also, you know, to interact with other people, but it's also good to be alone. And just to enjoy that peace and quietness. But when the mind is very agitated, then naturally craving arises. And so we have this, we suffer from loneliness and isolation. And this is why also the practice of loving kindness can also be beneficial in overcoming this fear of loneliness and isolation. Because we start sending loving kindness to ourselves, then to family, then to friends, to co-workers, to neighbors, and then to all beings, send loving kindness to all beings. So by doing that, you go beyond the narrow space of the self, the me center. So we can overcome that fear of loneliness and isolation. Now, the fear of pain whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, that has to do with memory. Because say if you've experienced physical pain or emotional pain, when we remember that experience, naturally we don't want to repeat that painful experience, right? So there's a fear of pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain. Whereas if we experience something very pleasurable, the opposite happens. Although we cannot cling to a pleasurable experience or a happy feeling, But the mind holds on to it as memory, right? Because we have this thing called memory. So when we remember this pleasurable experience, we naturally want to repeat it. Whereas when we remember something painful, either physical pain or emotional pain, we don't want to repeat it because it's very unpleasant. Hence the fear of pain and the craving for more pleasure. Now, the fear of authority and the fear of ghosts and spirits, we mentioned there's a connection between the two. Just like some other fears, and it has to do with childhood. It begins in childhood. Say if you've had very strict parents, or one parent is very strict. That's where it begins, the fear of that strict parent or parents. And then you go to school, and then there's a fear of the teacher. And sometimes the fear of the school principal. Because where I grew up in elementary school, all teachers were allowed to beat the students. So you can imagine there was that fear of being hit. But in the high school, which was based on the British system, only the headmaster was allowed to beat you. And then you carry that fear in the work environment. So there's a fear of the boss or the supervisor. And sometimes if you go to a temple and the head monk is a little stern or a little serious, there's a fear of the head monk. So you can see that fear it starts in childhood. The fear of authority. And as we said, the fear of ghosts and spirits, it also comes from childhood. And the power of the imagination. And this is why, when possible, I like to do the cemetery meditation. So people can use mindfulness to overcome this fear. But the imagination is very strong. And I mentioned that before, that there's one experiment that I often do on myself, so I can learn about the power of the imagination. And the experiment I like to do is in the evening. Of course, there's no internet around. And I just say to myself, there's something in the room. There's a presence in the room. And every time I say that, automatically I get shivers and I have goosebumps. And sure enough, I feel a presence, and it's usually right behind me. And it's watching me. I dare you to try that, if you're not too scared. But this is where you test your mindfulness. Because if you're not mindful, you leave the room as quick as possible. You get the hell out of there. Because it's so scary, this thing. But if you apply mindfulness, you can overcome it. But I do it all the time just so I can see the power of the imagination, how powerful it is. At the moment, I'm staying in this building, and throughout the day and throughout the evening, there are always sounds. All these sounds keep coming up. And of course, if you're not mindful, you think, it's some supernatural force that's creating the sound. But again, that's a reaction is the power of the imagination. How the mind can create all these things. The fear of public opinion. That comes from having an image of ourselves. And whenever we have an image of ourselves, we naturally want to protect that image. And the more attached we are to this image, then we have that fear, the fear of public opinion. What people are saying about me, or even thinking about me. So the question is it possible not to have an image of yourself? Is that possible? And with mindful practice, it is possible. Because you can let go of whatever image the mind creates. And you begin to trust in this present moment awareness, mindfulness. Because you see that this present moment, mindfulness, awareness, is really who we are. It's not this I, and it's not the image that we have of ourselves. Of course, it's better to have a positive image than to have a negative image of yourself. But even if you have a positive image of yourself, it still creates a conflict. Because we're always trying to protect this image. But when we realize that the awareness is who we really are, then there's no need for an image. We can let go of that image. And also what is interesting is that when we look in the mirror and you see an image, right, we relate to that image. We think that image is who we are. And half the time we're not pleased with that image. And some days you look in the mirror and you say, well, today I'm not too bad. I'll never be a beauty queen or a fashion model, but today I'm okay. But then 2 days later you look in the mirror and think, oh my God, I look awful. What happened? And what the Dhamma is showing us is that that image that you see, who you think you are, is not really you. It's just a physical body, and it's changing. It's subject to change. Another good example, you can try this. Look at your photos, and you can see that the body is aging. And think, oh my God, I'm getting old. I thought I was young. Now, I'm an old man or an old woman. But somehow, say if you're feeling fairly healthy, somehow you feel the same. Have you noticed that? The photos that you're seeing is aging, but somehow you feel the same. It shows you that who you really are is not the photos, is not the aging body, but is the awareness. It's the awareness. And another good example, maybe you've had this experience where, one day you're not feeling very well. You're just not in a good mood. Maybe you're also sick. But you're just not in a good mood. And you happen to meet a friend. And the friend says, "Wow, you're looking so lovely today." And you're thinking, what the hell are you talking about? Because, what you're experiencing, how you're feeling, has nothing to do, with that image that your friend is seeing. What we call the public image. Very interesting. But we are so attached to that, that external image. I know in the West it's like this, in North America, they're so attached to the image. And every time you meet somebody, it's a social habit. You have to pay a compliment, even if you don't mean it. Half the time you're actually telling lies, But you want that person to feel good, right? And of course, when you're brought up in that type of conditioning, that type of society, you become very attached to compliments. And when we're very attached to compliments, naturally, we're afraid of the opposite, right? We're afraid of, being blamed, being criticized, and so on. So this is why people pay you a compliment, you can say thank you, but don't be attached to it. Don't take it too seriously. And of course, the real challenge, if somebody is criticizing you or blaming you, you just smile and you say thank you also. But don't take it personally. Because you find that when you don't react to somebody's unpleasantness, you realize it's their problem, it's not yours. You understand? It's their problem. It's their mental defilement, mental delusion. It's not you. Yeah. This is why the Buddha's advice, there's a lot of wisdom in that. When you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. Regarding the fear of not achieving enlightenment, of becoming an arahant or a bodhisattva, Ajahn Chah, the very wise forest monk from Thailand, he gave a very, very wise advice to this. He said, don't be an arahant, don't be a bodhisattva, don't be anything at all. Because if you think you're somebody or something special, you're going to suffer. Don't be an arahant, don't be a bodhisattva, don't be anything at all. Because if you think you're someone special, you're going to suffer. There's a lot of wisdom in that. And this is why an aspect of practice is learning how to be. Just when you're calm, when you're feeling peaceful, you can just be in that state of just being. That is the awakened state of just being. Because normally we are called in becoming. In Dhamma language we say becoming, meaning the craving, to become something, to achieve something, to get something, to possess something, and so on. Of course, in daily life, if you're in the working world, there are certain things you have to do, certain things you have to achieve, right? But if you're always caught in this becoming, this constant striving, you will always experience that fear, the fear of not becoming, fear of not achieving, not having, and so on. So in that state of being, just being calm, being present, you're free from all this becoming, striving, and the fear of not becoming. So you're free from time. Just like when we have regrets. Sometimes there's also an aspect of becoming, but it's related to the past. When you say, oh, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Or if I just thought about it, earlier, things would be much better. Why didn't I think of it before? I'm so stupid. Right? There's an aspect of becoming, but it's related to the past. But in that state of being, you're free from becoming in the past and becoming in the future. This is a very peaceful state, and you're free from time. So this is why, if you're in the working world, it's very beneficial, even for half an hour or 20 minutes. When you're at home, just learn how to be. Just come back to the present moment. And if you're feeling some kind of stress, then you do something physical, whatever it is you do, just to release that stress, that physical stress. Whether it's running, brisk walking, swimming, Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, whatever you do, even dancing. Just to release that physical stress, physical tension, and then you just sit quietly and just come to that timeless state of just being. Now, what are the connecting factors of fear? The most obvious factor of mental, psychological fear is, of course, thinking, right? If it's mental, psychological, it has to be thinking. That's the main factor, thinking. And with thinking, there is time, right, as past and future. Because thinking is what creates time, as past and future. And time is also a factor of anxiety and also stress, right? There's so much to do and so little time. So thinking is related to time. Thinking is time, as past and future. And the third factor is desire, craving. Any form of craving, desire, expectation. That's one of the factors of fear. As we mentioned, whenever we have any kind of desire, craving, expectation, there's always fear. Right? The fear that you won't get what you want. So those are the three factors. Thinking, time, and desire. Craving. You can reflect on it. And desire also includes expectation. Right? When you're expecting something, that is a form of craving, right? Needing. And we get to the root of fear. And the root of fear, of course, is the self, yeah? Strong attachment to the self. And when we investigate, we begin to see that the self is not something permanent or separate. It only feels that way. But it's just a conditioning in the mind. And because we're caught in this illusion of a permanent, separate self, we tend to ask this question: what happens to me when I die, and where do I go after death? It's a very ancient question. And people are asking the same question today. And in future, they'll be asking the same question. Because the I feels separate. And as you know, the Buddha was the first person to realize that the self is just a conditioning of the mind, based on thinking, memory, and the use of language. I, you, he, she, and so on. So we all have a self. We cannot avoid it. We've been conditioned with this idea of, I, me, mine. But when you investigate, we begin to see the nature of it. Now, for example, when you meet somebody for the first time, and you naturally talk about yourselves, what do you talk about when you talk about yourself? It's all personal history, isn't it? All based on memory, right? Where you were born, your family background, elementary school, then high school, college. Think about all the books you have read, all the movies you have seen, things you have seen on television. Internet, everything that you see on internet. And if you've traveled, you speak about your travel experiences, right? And where you'd like to travel to next time. And of course, if you're in the working world, you speak about your work history, right? Speak about your work history. In other words, who we are as a conditioned being, conditioned self, is all based on memory. Personal history, collection of memories. That's all. And then we have the unconditioned state of mind, which is present moment awareness, the knowing. And a good example of this, of the conditioned self that we all have related to memory, is when somebody suffers from amnesia, temporary memory loss, right? And somebody who's suffering from amnesia, you can imagine how scary it is. It's very confusing, very scary. Simply because when you lose your memory, you don't know who you are, right? Because we identify with all our memories, this I, the conditioned self that we have. Including not only pleasant memories, but also unpleasant memories. So this is why when we practice, when we do Dhamma practice, and we realize the unconditioned state, which is present moment awareness, mindfulness, is who we really are in the present moment, the unconditioned state. So yes, we have memories, we have all these past experiences, but we become, how do you say, we become less attached to them. They're still there. You can't get rid of your memories unless, of course, if you're having Alzheimer's. But apart from that, it's really learning how to relate to your past experiences, including unpleasant memories. And as we said, unpleasant memories seem very permanent, very solid, simply because there are emotions involved, if they trigger any emotions. But with mindfulness, we begin to see that unpleasant memories are really just thoughts and images that are happening in the present moment. They may be related to past experiences, but the actual experience itself are just thoughts and images that are happening now. And that is the wisdom of mindfulness, present moment awareness. It's only thinking, thinking, thinking. So we just see them as just thoughts and images, and we let them go. And if they happen to arise again, later on, same thing. Only thinking, thinking, thinking. And you let them go. Because they are impermanent. They are only temporary mental objects. They arise and they pass away. Just like when you're thinking about the future, it's the same thing. They're just thoughts and images that are happening now. Of course, sometimes we have to think about the future. But the only thing is that if we become too obsessed, right? If we become too obsessed, then we experience, anxiety, fear, and so on. So have those future plans, future goals, but don't become too attached to them. Because the future is uncertain. And sometimes we achieve certain goals and we're disappointed. It's not what we expected. And sometimes our priorities change, because we are changing. And yes, sometimes there's a sense of accomplishment. You've achieved something and you feel good. But then that experience doesn't last very long. I would say about 2 weeks maximum. 2 weeks maximum. And then you begin to look for something else, some other goal to achieve. And then there's a very unique situation where there are a few people who are able to achieve all their goals. Say even in middle age, say even in their 40s, they're able to achieve all the goals that they had. And they felt very happy, very satisfied. But when that sense of achievement went away, they began to panic. A very unique situation. And I had a friend who experienced this very same thing. He achieved all his goals, as an emergency doctor. He felt a sense of accomplishment, But after 2 weeks, he began to panic. And he began to panic simply because there are no more goals to achieve. You see that? But the craving mind is still in operation. And that's why the panic sets in. And if you're not mindful, in desperation, you want to achieve something else, something that you really don't need. But that's the nature of the craving mind. So I told my friend in Singapore, thanks to the speed of internet, it's time to sit on your cushion and learn to be. They're caught in craving, and that's why you're panicking. You're always craving to achieve another goal. It's time to sit and just learn to be. Just the peace, the simplicity of just being. No more becoming and the fear of not becoming. So how do we deal with fear when fear arises? One way is to apply mindfulness, and we objectify the fear. Because mindfulness, awareness, gives us that ability to see something objectively and let it go. So instead of saying, I'm scared, I'm afraid, you say, there is a state of fear, or there is fear. And you remind yourself, this is impermanent. It's a temporary mental state, a changing condition of the mind. Because when there's fear, that fear seems very real, doesn't it? And of course, when you're paranoid, you're totally deluded by that fear. It's very real. It seems very real. But when we apply mindfulness, we see fear as just fear. And we know it is impermanent. This too shall pass. And then we can do loving kindness meditation. May I be well, happy, and peaceful. May I be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. May all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. May all beings be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. Another way, as taught by Thich Nhat Hanh, the well-known Vietnamese teacher, he calls it mindful breathing and smiling. Breathing in, I know there's fear in me. Breathing out, I smile. And you smile mindfully at the fear. Breathing in, I know there's fear in me. Breathing out, I smile. Likewise, breathing in, I know there's frustration in me. Breathing out, I smile. Breathing in, I know there's craving in me. Breathing out, I smile. This too shall pass. It is impermanent. Another way is to do mindful chanting. Something that's very simple. Because when you can do mindful chanting, you let go of those thoughts that are creating the fear, the worry, the anxiety. we can do this chanting afterwards. So at this time, are there any questions? Any questions that you'd like to ask? But the reflection on the body and the mind as a process, constantly changing process, is one way of seeing that the I, the self, is not something which is permanent and is not something which is separate from the world. But we feel separate because of the conditioning that we have. Is called duality. And duality starts very early when a child begins to speak. When a child begins to say, I want this, or I want that. I don't want this, I don't want that. I like this, or I don't like that. That is the beginning of duality. Duality means subject and object, right? And the I is always the subject, right? I like this, I don't like. I want, I don't want. That's the duality. And this duality becomes more deep-rooted in the mind. When we begin to say, I am seeing something, I am hearing something, I'm smelling something, I'm tasting something, I'm feeling something by touch, and I'm thinking something. Yes, the duality continues. So the I begins to feel separate. And what is interesting is that really the senses are sensing by themselves. There's really no I who's actually seeing something, or hearing something, or smelling something, or tasting something. And this was one of the insights of the Buddha. We only believe that there's an I who is seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking because of our habit of identification, right? We identify with these experiences. So we say, I'm seeing something. I think we did this experiment before. For example, just look at the Buddha statue, okay? Now close your eyes for a moment, and then open your eyes. You see that seeing arises automatically, doesn't it? You don't have to make a special effort to see. You just open your eyes and there's seeing. In other words, there's no I, no me who is seeing the statue. There's only seeing. And you recognize that it's a statue. That's what perception is. Perception means you're able to recognize something because of memory, previous experience. In the same way, you don't have to make an effort to hear the speaker, right? As long as your ears are healthy, there's only hearing. And you begin to eat something, and tasting arises naturally. And when you go home this evening, and if you're eating something, you can try that. Say, okay, I'm going to eat this thing, and I'm going to try not to taste it. You can try that as an experiment. I'm going to try not to taste this. right? You see, whether you like it or not, tasting will arise, right? There's no I who's tasting the food. There's only tasting. Right? Your body touches something, and there's just feeling, touch, sensation. But we're so conditioned, right, to identify with experiences. You know, I am this, I am this, I am this. So we're caught in that duality of separation. And the I seems permanent, right? And part of it too is the use of language. Because you know, if you have to speak a lot, say in one day, all right, you have to use the word I, and if you're speaking a lot, you can use this I hundreds of times. So it gives the impression in the mind, in consciousness, that the I is rock solid. It's always there. It's everlasting. Because we keep saying I all the time. And if you're speaking Mandarin, you use the word wo, right? Wo. But if you're mindful, you realize it's just a label that we have to use to communicate. That's all. So we can still use I, you know, when we're speaking, but we have this understanding. So in other words, we don't take the I so seriously. So the problem is not the I, the self, but is a strong attachment to the self. When we take ourselves too seriously. We think it's permanent and we think it's separate. It's separate from the world. And that's why we ask that question, what happens to me when I die and where do I go after death? Because as long as you are trapped in this I, in thinking wants to continue after death. Because, as we said, thinking is related to all our experiences, right? All our memories, all the information we have, including all our attachments. Everything that we know. And we're afraid to let go of our attachments. So we want to continue somehow after death. And that's why we have created many beliefs in an afterlife. And there are many beliefs, many beliefs. As I said before, the belief in reincarnation or rebirth is only one belief. There are many. One of the interesting insights that the Buddha had was the whole nature of consciousness itself. Because he related consciousness to the senses. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. And you realize that thinking, that consciousness is always changing, is not something permanent. But many people believe that consciousness is permanent. But it's always changing. For example, say before you came here this evening, say if you ate something, a part of consciousness included tasting and smelling, right? But now there is no tasting or smelling. So what do we have in consciousness at this moment? There's seeing, hearing, and feeling, right? You feel your body sitting. Now again, close your eyes. There is no seeing consciousness, but there's still hearing and feeling. Now open your eyes, and there is seeing consciousness again. That's the nature of consciousness. It keeps changing. In other words, consciousness is its content. Whatever happens with our sense experience, that's a part of consciousness. And when you go home, if you start to eat something or drink something, then tasting and smelling will arise again. And tonight, when we all go to bed and we go into deep sleep state, there is no consciousness. The deep sleep state. And for adults, it's between 1 to 2 hours. For young children, deep sleep state tends to be a bit longer. But for adults, it's between 1 to 2 hours. There is no consciousness. In other words, the world as we know it does not exist in deep sleep state. We actually die, mentally. The body might be alive, but mentally, psychologically, nothing. This is why there's an old saying. When somebody is in deep sleep and they're not aware of anything, we say that person is dead to the world. That's an old saying. Meaning you don't know anything. Malaysia does not exist. Even your family and friends do not exist. If you're working, your job does not exist. And you're crazy, a supervisor does not exist. It's good to know. But when the brain comes out of that deep sleep state, the thought process starts up again. And that's what we call the dream state. And if you observe your dreams, you see they're mostly just memories all mixed up. Have you ever noticed that? They're all mixed up. Plus some fantasies. Sometimes you have some anxiety, in your daily life. Sometimes it comes out in your dream, right? And very often, if some important event is coming up, you tend to dream about it, right? Something important is going to come. You tend to dream about it, including taking a trip somewhere, right? And you're looking forward to it. Very often, you'll dream about it. And sometimes, say, if you're flying somewhere, you have some difficulty getting to the airport. And yes, you miss your flight. But when you wake up, oh my God, thank God, it's just a dream. It's just the nature of dreams. Yeah, it's all memory, information, all mixed up. Very interesting. And then we wake up, and the world comes back. The world of, say, Malaysia. The whole world comes back into existence. So in other words, it is consciousness that creates the world. Through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. This is why the Buddha said, mind is the forerunner of all things. We experience the whole world, including, the external physical world, through the mind. And again, the good example is the statue. Right, there's a physical statue here, but you close your eyes again. One more experiment. You close your eyes for a moment, and you open your eyes, and you see that your experience of the statue is in the mind, right? Through seeing consciousness. That is what the Buddha was pointing to. Mind is the forerunner of all things. Okay, any questions? Any questions? Sorry? Huh? Where's the mind? Never mind. The mind is asking that question. Yeah, it's all here. It's all here. Okay. There are two aspects to the mind. There's a conditioned mind, which is thinking, right? Thinking and memory and information, right? And future projection. That's the conditioned mind, the thinking mind. We all have this. And then there's the unconditioned mind, which is awareness, the knowing. So the awareness we had as children is the same awareness we have today. It doesn't change. The only difference is that a child does not understand this. But as adults, we can understand it. It's unconditioned. All right, you see the difference. Yeah. So sometimes we need to use the conditioned mind, thinking, memory, information. And when we don't need to think, we come back to the unconditioned state. Awareness and knowing. And that state is peaceful. Yes. How can somebody transfer merit to another? You mean somebody who has passed away? Or just... Well, you see, personally, I don't believe that just by saying a few words, say in Pali, that you can actually transfer merit, to somebody, whether they're alive or deceased. Although it seems like a nice idea. The merit comes from your own understanding, right? Your own practice, your own mindfulness. And naturally, that improves your state of mind. All your wholesome qualities. That's where the merit is. More kindness, more compassion, more patience, the ability to forgive others and to forgive yourself. And automatically, those good qualities from your practice, you can use the word, naturally, it affects your relationship to others. How you relate to people in the society. Because life is based on relationship, right? You see what I mean? That is how you affect society. But I know it's part of the Theravada tradition, to say a few Pali terms and you transfer merit, usually to deceased people. But this is my understanding. But if people would like to transfer merits, fine. They can do it, if it makes them feel good. Yeah. Yes, as I mentioned before, many people in Malaysia, they see karma as something that you store somewhere. It's like having a bank account. You have one account for good karma, one account for bad karma. But from my understanding, karma is simply cause and effect. What you do and the results of that action. And if you're aware, you can see this. In other words, karma is something which is always happening. Right? What you do and the results of what you do. Right? For example, sometimes, say, you have something to eat and you get stomach upset. Simply cause and effect. It's something which is happening all the time. Because the meaning of the word karma is to do. What you do and the results of that action. Okay? Just reflect on it. Just reflect on it. You see, part of human nature is because we don't really investigate, or we don't know how to train the mind to investigate things. We tend to want to find easy, convenient answers to explain things that we don't understand or that we cannot control. Then we say, oh, it must be past karma. And a good example of that was when they had the Indian Ocean tsunami many years ago. I think 2004. And what did the Christians say? God was punishing the sinners. The Muslims said more or less the same thing. Allah was punishing the non-believers. And the rest of Asia said, it must be past karma. That was causing the tsunami. They're being punished by the tsunami. I'm sorry to say this, but that's nonsense. Rubbish. Because natural forces, natural disasters have nothing to do with karma. You understand? Because karma is what we do and the results of that action. Cause and effect, and so on. But it's a part of human nature, right? We just want easy, convenient answers to explain anything we cannot understand or is beyond our control. Right? It's God's will. See, so easy, right? Blame it on God. Or blame it on past karma. So I used to say, poor past karma. It gets blamed for everything. Yes, sir. Sorry, I can't hear.
How do we explain our words in this life? I mean, they're not all the same. They're different. Like we are born in different places, in various countries. So, I mean, we have
Actually, it's very simple. One night, our parents got together to have a little fun, and the conditions were right, and here we are. Very simple. But we tend to forget that. Right? Yeah. Because people say, why was I born? There must be some special meaning. I said, no la, no special meaning. It's biological, okay? It's just biological. And the conditions happen to be right. Yeah. Because, some couples would like to conceive, and they can't, simply because the conditions are not there. And sometimes they do conceive, but the conditions in the uterus, is not right, so there's miscarriage. You understand? It has to do with cause and conditions. You don't blame it on poor past karma or God. Or let's just say it's nature. Because really God is nature. It's just a symbol of nature. That's right. And nature is very complex. It's a very, very complex thing, when we investigate. It's not just some trees and birds and cows eating grass out in the field. Nature is much more complex, than meets the eye.
Can you equate the Dharma as nature?
That's right, yes. It has to do with the laws of nature. The laws of nature. How things are interdependent, interconnected. That's right. Things happen due to cause and conditions, and so on. Yes.
My name is Jasmine. Recent year, I feel surrounding me that is many teenage that have this we so-called a mental emotional. They always think something that's always repeating in a sadness way. Like when you ask one, they say they are sad due to some reason. When we ask question 1, 2, 3, they come back to 1, 2, 3. That means in circle, they're thinking. So as a listener, like me, as a mom also, I just wonder how to help those children, like teenage. Sometimes they are 14, 16, even 18. I always believe in God. But children, teenage now is not. Yeah. And I try many ways. Sometimes I try to talk about Buddhists, talk about religions. Difficult. Maybe I'm not experienced enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Because it's important that you have children to understand that we're a part of nature. We're not separate from nature. You understand? So in other words, if you believe in God, that's fine. But if other people don't believe in God, that's also okay. But the important thing is to understand that we're a part of nature. We're not separate from nature. And for example, just look at the body itself. You see that the body belongs to nature. It's not really a personal thing. For example, if we tell the body not to get sick, does the body listen to us? It doesn't. The body will get sick due to certain conditions, right? Just like if you tell the body not to get tired, not to feel sleepy, not to get hungry, not to go to washroom, and so on, the body will experience those things because it follows its own natural laws. Just like aging, right? If you tell the body not to age, the body not to die, the body will age, the body will die. Because that's the nature of the body. In other words, it belongs to the changing conditions of nature. It doesn't belong to a self. And how everything is interrelated. For example, the oxygen we breathe is what the trees, they exhale. They produce, for example, trees that produce fruit, we can relate to those trees, right? Because we eat those fruits. But even trees that do not produce fruit, we're still related to them, right? Because they breathe in carbon dioxide, and they produce oxygen, and we breathe in oxygen, and we exhale carbon dioxide. So in that way, we're related. Another good example is just drinking. Where does the water comes from? Any liquid at all, there are clouds. So we are related to clouds, and of course the rain, and the sun, the energy of the sun, and of course the oceans. So we are related. We don't exist as some separate entity, independent entity. Yeah.
We no need to use the religion to talk. We can use the natural to talk with them. Basically, your thinking shouldn't talk just only yourself. My understanding, what Bhante tried to teaching us is like to use the natural to talk with them actually is related to the whole nature that we have in the earth. It's not just yourself.
Yes.
Hi, thank you.
That's right.
Yes.
And actually God is just a symbol of nature. But we create an image in our mind. But actually it's just a symbol of nature. Because I grew up as a Christian. So I was always asking, who is God? Where is God? And I was always looking for God. Because they say, if you do anything naughty, God is going to punish you. So you have this fear. And they say God is everywhere, but I'm looking, there's no God. Because I've created an image that God is this, this big man, right? And he's carrying, a big stick. So I was always looking, but eventually I began to understand that really God is just a symbol of nature. And when you investigate, you see that nature is very, very complex. Very complex. It's a very complex web, like a spider's web. Life is a very complex web of interconnectedness and interdependency. But when we're caught in thinking, we don't see this. Because I feel separate, and we don't see how things are connected. And one thing you could share with the children is this dynamic meditation. It's an easy form of mindfulness. I'll give you the link on YouTube. Yeah. Because it's a very easy practice. I'll just demonstrate it. So this is a very easy way to focus the mind. And you can let go of thoughts, let go of unnecessary thinking. Because sometimes the mindful breathing is not easy, right? Because of the wandering mind. So this practice is very good for young people, for teenagers and so on. So I'll give you the link. I'll give you the link. Yeah. Okay, so very briefly, I'll just do the mindful chanting that you can do if you're having some fear or any disturbing thoughts in your mind, including worry, if you're worrying about something. And the words are Gatte, Gatte, Para, Gatte, Parasam, Gatte, Bodhisvaha. It's in Sanskrit. And it means going well beyond the world of ignorance and delusion, going beyond the illusion of duality and separation. Rejoice in the freedom, bliss, and peace of awakening. Okay, so I'll start and you can join me. Gatte, Gatte, Para, Gatte, Parasam, Gatte, Bodhisvaha. 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 So may you all be well, happy, peaceful, and may you all be free from fear. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.